Hi guys, it's Sophie. Whittaker. So I wanted to chat to you guys about the books that I read in June. I feel like I did pretty well with my reading in June, considering that that was pretty much the first month of Whit's life. And I'm going to share them in categories. I'm going to do fiction, non-fiction and children's books. So new category for me, but I thought it'd be fun to share which new children's books I've read, as in I've read for the first time, with you as well, my wrap-ups. So without further ado, we'll start with fiction. So I read 2 fiction books in June. The first one I read was What I'd Rather Not Think About by Genti Posthumer. This one is a story about a sister who loses her twin brother to suicide. And it's told in very tiny vignettes. So I will just show you. They can be as long as a page and a half. Sometimes they are just a few lines. And I think that even the way I've described this perhaps feels wrong for how this book is told. We know as the reader that this narrator's brother will have ended his life by the time we get to the end of this book, but he's alive for the majority of the reading experience. We, as the reader, kind of have the opportunity to traverse through these memories and these moments with sister and her twin brother, where he's still here but is intent on leaving the world. And we move from a place where perhaps that wasn't so true to a place where it becomes really blindingly obvious. I think the overwhelming feeling I had when reading this book was the desire to change the outcome that we knew from the beginning from reading just the Dusk Jacket. So I wanted to have the end of this book not be true. I didn't want for him to have ended his life at some point in these pages. I think I found this to be a really powerful story of depression, and the way that it was told in these kind of brief moments that reflect both the brother's life and the sister's life felt very accurate to what it's like to be living with someone with mental illness and how that can adjust and change over time. It's one I really enjoyed, and I know that you may have heard a bit about this one already, but if you have and you haven't picked it up, it is one I would definitely recommend. Then the next fiction book I read was Martyr by Quebec Akbar. I enjoyed some aspects of this book more than others, so I'll talk a little bit about both, but I'll just tell you first what the book's about. So this book follows a young man called Sirius, who is living in America, was born in Iran. His mother died in a plane that was shot down by the US government, and we see Sirius, newly sober, trying to navigate his life and coming to terms with his dual identities as an Iranian and an American, and how those two worlds can possibly intersect, and the grief and loneliness and confusion that he feels in living in these two lands simultaneously. Sirius has few relationships, I would say. He has relationships with only a small number of people within this book, and has isolated himself in quite a substantial way from the world, from his culture in both the Iranian and the American sense. He's a poet who writes poems about his homeland, but has no real experience or memories of them, and there's definitely this sense of disconnect. This story, the kind of main point of the storyline, follows Sirius as he meets a dying woman who is in an art gallery, choosing to exhibit her death as the last piece of her performance art. So she is setting up camp in this art gallery and dying live in front of people who can come in and have conversations with her. I very much enjoyed aspects of this book. So when I first bought it and first started reading through it, I definitely thought it was going to be a 5-star, maybe one of my books of the year. So I'll tell you why I thought that. I think that the language that is used in this book is so gorgeous. The writer's actually a poet before a novelist, and you can definitely tell some of the turns of phrases felt really unique and strong and hit places where you didn't anticipate that they would have done. Just the way that language was used is really clever and really fun, and I definitely would recommend it for that point alone. I also think that it felt very immediate and very real, so within the first sort of couple of chapters I felt fully immersed into this world. I was brought in and connected with Sirius and with his world immediately. The aspects I didn't like are kind of probably more towards the spoilery side, so you might want to just have a little moment, and I'll put up on the screen when it's safe to come back. But I think that throughout the book, Sirius and his relationship with himself, but also with this woman in the museum, and with Z, sort of these main relationships that they have that are meaningful. Sirius, I think, went from turns to sort of bleak to bleaker to very dark quite quickly, and by the end I'd sort of disconnected from him a little bit as a character. I'd wanted to see, I think, a little bit more of a movement and emotion from him, and I think I saw perhaps an entrenching of some of the initial character traits that we'd explored with him, and I felt at times that he almost moved to the melodramatic, which I found quite frustrating as the reader. I'd wanted to see a little bit more development from him. I won't share specifically what the reveal is in this book. There is a reveal in this book, and for me it also felt a little bit overwrought. I didn't believe it. So I had this experience of really enjoying the book, the premises and the writing, but toward the end feeling ultimately unsatisfied with the reading experience, which I think is a little bit of a shame. I would definitely pick up the second novel if this author ever writes a second novel, because I think that it might be that some of that's developing from that debut place into a more established novelist. But I did enjoy it. It's not a don't bother reading it, but there are a few things I didn't like. So that is Marta. Then moving on to non-fiction, I read 4 non-fiction books in June. So the first one is Disobedient Bodies, and this is by Emma Dabry. Yeah, Emma Dabry. And this is a tiddly tiny short little book which talks about beauty and the pressures that we are under as women to be beautiful and what that means, what that looks like. It paired with an exhibit at the Wellcome Collection that I went to and really enjoyed, that again connects with the same kind of topics, thinking about the Eurocentrism of beauty, what that looks like, what alternative images of beauty may look like, where beauty came from, sort of celebrating some of the history of beauty outside again of that very European-centric ideals, but also thinking about the ways in which beauty have been distorted and managed in the time of social media, in the time of tweakments and easy access to things like fillers on lunch breaks. How does that impact the way in which we think about beauty and beauty culture? I really enjoyed this little book, and if you want to have just a little taste into that topic, I thought it was a brilliant little read and would definitely recommend. Then the next one that I read, I think I read in a bit of a blur because this was the first book I read after Wit was born, and this is Alphabetical Diaries by Sheila Heti. I chose to read this book because of the way that it's formatted and the way that it functions, so I'll tell you about that and then I'll tell you about my relationship to it. So Sheila Heti chose to write this book by navigating, I can't remember how many years worth, a decade's worth of journals, entering them into a spreadsheet and alphabetizing the sentences. So all of these words, I think 6,000 words is what's left, yeah, 60,000 words is what's left. She alphabetized all of them, sorted through them, and pulled out aspects of these in alphabetical order that told a bit of the story of the decade of her life. It's a very unique book and a very interesting way to try to navigate memoir. I'm not surprised that it's by Sheila Heti. I love her innovation in the way that she writes. It was an unusual way to read, so you can't follow a narrative in the same way that you might do naturally in memoir or in writing of any other kind. It wasn't even as long as vignettes. We're talking literally sentence by sentence. So if I just open, so it says, I asked her if she was making the stars out of silver paper and she said no, sandpaper. I asked her what she is most good at in the world and she said making, writing, directing, she wasn't sure what to call it. And I asked what her technique was and she said, I do it every day. I asked her whether deadlines are important and she says yes, because they can provide a container. I asked him if he cheated on me because our sex was bad or unsatisfying and he said no, not at all. I asked what his best quality as a boyfriend was and what was his worst and he said you first. So I said that the worst was my changeability and the best was how loving I am, and he acted shocked that I considered myself to be loving. So you very clearly can see an image of Sheila Heti and who she is without that providing like a linear narrative. The reason I read this as my first book was I think I perhaps intuitively understood that the time in the first few weeks of having a newborn baby, time doesn't operate in the same way. Time doesn't connect as a linear series of events, or at least in my memory that's not how time functioned. It was in these snapshots of awareness, of pleasure and pain and love and frustration and confusion and tiredness and all of these different things. And I think reading this book meant I could pick it up at any moment, and I wasn't expected to be grasping hold of immediately some narrative story and structure when it felt as if the world didn't have really much of a structure, and didn't progress in the way that usual time does. So I read it in that odd blurry state, but really enjoyed the fact that that was the book I chose to pick up, because I think it gave me that grace to find her in between all of these things and to find out what Sheila Heti was trying to write about without having to follow any kind of narrative about her throughout this decade. You do over time sort of imbibe this sense of her because of the fact that you're finding these repetitive characters or relationships, these moments in time, the relationship between herself and her craft, that are coming back up again and again. And she chooses the sentences and alphabetizes them in such a way that we get a sense of flux and flow, and it feels almost more like poetry, would be what I would say. You're kind of navigating through things rather than being spoon-fed a story. I really enjoyed this book, and I think it will probably have quite a special place because it was that first book that I had read, and I think if you're at all interested in kind of memoirs form, this is one I would definitely recommend. It's a really, really innovative way to share your life. I then read Beauty Myth by Naomi Wolf, and I'll probably put a picture up rather than hold the Kindle because the screen always goes off on the Kindle. So this one pairs with Disobedient Bodies, and I won't talk about it too much just because in my vlog I talked a lot about reading the Beauty Myth. The reason I wanted to read it was twofold. One was I'd recently read Doppelganger by Naomi Klein and had enjoyed that book, and it made me very curious about Naomi Wolf. Just a brief aside into Doppelganger. Doppelganger is about Naomi Klein, who is definitely not Naomi Wolf, but who on a number of different occasions has been confused for her. Naomi Wolf in the current sort of climate has moved into a very conspiratorial, right-wing, very odd, sort of dangerous position, and Naomi Klein was reflecting on Mistaken for this woman who has very different stance to her and who is definitely not her, but just because their first names are Naomi and because they write books. So I was very curious, having not read any Naomi Wolf, to kind of connect with that author from a way of reading around Doppelganger, really. And I perhaps may have picked the book up from that, but I also then had read Disobedient Bodies that we've spoken about, which references on beauty in a number of different aspects of it. So I thought, you know what, if I've got two books that I can benefit from reading around by reading a single book, that's definitely something I want to do. And I did enjoy the experience of having read that book and how that informed my reading of the two other books, Doppelganger and Disobedient Bodies, both of which I actually enjoyed more than the Beauty Myth. So what is the Beauty Myth, just in case you're also interested in reading it, or if it's one you might be thinking about having read either of the other two books I've spoken about. It's a feminist text of second wave feminism that looks at the ways in which beauty has been used as something to control and contain the behaviour of women, particularly when women have gained more rights in the workplace in terms of controls over earning, finances, and more equality in kind of sexual spheres, that beauty is being used as shackles to hold women back to the same challenges and limit women where they have gained more freedom, so that beauty has gained its pressures and its function as other aspects that control women have reduced. It was a really interesting book. The other thing I would recommend, if you're wanting to read it to read around, is also to listen to the If Books Could Kill podcast episode that mentions this book and talks through this book, because I am so glad I listened to that before reading The Beauty Myth. It talks all about the sort of history of Naomi Wolf, but also about which of these statistics and the ways in which she's interpreting data are just simply incorrect, which meant I could read this book with a real heavy pinch of salt, of kind of seeing it as how it was informing feminist thought at the time without necessarily diving directly into the actual facts and figures to be true. So for example, the podcast was talking about how Naomi Wolf had massively overblown some of the figures on eating disorders, and had sort of interpreted, I think it was something along the lines of 8 out of 10 women in American campuses would have an eating disorder, only 2 wouldn't, which obviously intuitively can't be right. So I think knowing all of those things, I could read it and understand how that played in, and I personally got some value from the book in terms of thinking about how do what are the ways that beauty and adornment sort of hold us back, and what are the ways that we are actually using those as women to be something that we're valuing and enjoying about ourselves, and that difficult dynamic. So I would say it's an interesting book to read, but I wouldn't recommend it on its own. I'd recommend it as an accompanying read, a little bit of like a cup of tea and a piece of cake. It's your cup of tea. So if that helps, if you're thinking about potentially reading any of those other books. And then the next one I read was The Age of Magical Overthinking by Amanda Montell. This is my cover of the year. I am obsessed with this cover. I also felt like the luckiest person ever, because having been obsessed with the cover, for some reason, like I have no idea why, the book that I got sent had 2 covers. This one has only 1, but there were 2. So I've managed to get an extra cover, which I've cut out and framed, and it's in my office. So I've got this beautiful book cover on my wall, which is just gorgeous. Anyway, enough about the book cover. This book I read because I'd started listening to the Cultish podcast in the very early days again of my recovery from having had wit. And the podcast I would definitely recommend if you don't already listen to it. Looks at different aspects of modern life, and which are a bit kind of culty. So things like Stanley bottles or trad wives, which are very culty, but sort of different aspects of things in our current zeitgeist, and talks a bit about what they are, why they're cult-like, and it's really just a way of kind of exploring cultural movements and moments, which I love, and it's something that I've missed ever since the Hilo stopped. I'm still grieving for the stop of the Hilo podcast. Again, if you've never listened to it, please go back. There's a whole backlog, and I found so many good book, TV, film, everything recommendations from that podcast. But this eats up a little bit of that kind of feeling too. So this book, The Age of Magical Overthinking, looks at a number of different ways in, again, in like a cultural climate, that we're using logical fallacies to sort of push us towards this concept of magical thinking or magical overthinking. So I'll just remind myself of the specific fallacies that she's discussing. So she talks about the halo effect of how when we have one aspect of a person, we then perceive other aspects of their personality to be overwhelmingly positive. She also talks about proportionality bias, sunk cost fallacy, zero-sum bias, survivorship bias, the recency illusion, overconfidence bias, the illusory truth effect, and confirmation bias. Oh, and declinism. So there's a number of different aspects that she talks about, but really what she's using very cleverly is aspects of our current culture to investigate these and to talk about the reason why we are now in this place of doing this sort of magical overthinking. And I think it's just a really pacey, fun read that lets you explore something about today's culture with a light touch, but diving into some quite interesting aspects of these different things that we use and that we're using to justify or utilise ourselves. So just for example, the halo effect chapter talks about Taylor Swift. So it talks about how Taylor Swift, who I know lots of people really love, I'm Switzerland about Taylor Swift. I'm sure she makes fine music, I dance on the radio sometimes, but I'm also not completely obsessed with her. And how she's attained like godlike status for some of the people that do really enjoy her music, that she's become like fashion icon or someone to take relationship guidance from or life guidance from, and how we then become enormously disappointed when that person doesn't live up to our ideals. So Taylor Swift had a relationship with a man who wasn't somebody that Taylor Swift's fans thought she should be with, which caused her to be sort of run off of which caused her to receive a lot of negative commentary. And she'd also made some comments sort of on a political basis which fans were keen to have her expand upon and spend more time on, and when she didn't, again, she was very heavily criticised for her actions. So just as an example, it talks about how do we venerate celebrities, talking just through Taylor Swift for an example. And I think it's great fun. I think most people who like that kind of stuff of the current moment, and I definitely do, it's one of my favourite types of thing. I love those videos on YouTube where people will talk about like things like the dark side of clean talk. Amazing. I'm completely drawn in by that kind of stuff. So I definitely would recommend this one. It's definitely one of the favourite books I've read so far this year, I think. And then just quickly, there are 2 children's books that I read this month. The first one is not one that's new to me. It's one I read to death as a child. It's Each Peach Pear Plum. Oh my god, I love this book. I'm slowly buying books for Whit. We had a number of books I'd bought just for myself before he arrived, and each month I'm just buying a couple of books for him and reading them through. So this is the first one that I'd read. If you haven't read it, it's an I Spy book by Janet and Alan Alberg, and it goes through and asks you to find the little character. So each peach, pear, plum, I spy Tom Thumb. Can you see the Tom Thumb? So yes, this one's obviously Whit's not going to be able to play with them yet, but I'm enjoying buying them, getting him a nice little collection of some classics and some new books, and I think it's good for me to read to him anyways. He's been read to a lot. So yeah, that's the first one that I read this month. The second one I got is perhaps less familiar to more people, which is The Tree Next Door. And that is by Charlie Moyer and Martin Stanev. I really can't read the font on the front of this book. I tried to read it, the book down the bottom, and I really honestly couldn't. This book is a story of a old woman who has a tree in her garden that's overlooked by a number of different houses and flats, and she has this garden and this tree which is sort of a glimpse of the outside for these people who don't necessarily have outside space of their own. It's really beautifully drawn and looks at the relationship that this woman develops with a young girl who lives close by, and talks a little bit about community as well. So you can see sort of the people in their houses there, and then there are some absolutely gorgeous, I'm just going to try and find them, illustrations of the tree through the seasons. And it's just a little bit of a story about community and togetherness and the positive impact that we can have on those who live close to us. And I really enjoyed this one. I'm collecting lots of sort of naturey, gardeny books for Whit. I don't know why. The whole way through my pregnancy I'm convinced that he's going to want to do something with the outside. It's like the only prediction I had for him is that he's going to want to do things outside. So every time I see a book I'm like, oh cool, he'll like that. Whether he will or not is yet to be seen. But yes, I thought that would be fun to just kind of catch up on June. I haven't yet decided quite how I'm going to catch you up on what I read in my break. I'll probably do like a best of my break or a best of each year, maybe. But yeah, that was June, and I'm excited to tell you more about July as we go into July as well. I feel like I've read pretty well considering I had a 2-day-old baby when we got into the 1st of June. So yes, I'll look forward to seeing you guys in my next video, and look after yourselves until then. Bye!